Thank you for joining us at today's program featuring artist Jaime Muñoz, presented as part of the Wignall Museum's Home Edition. Home Edition is a series of curated artist talks, workshops, and discussions featuring artists and cultural workers. My name is Rebecca Treywick, and I serve as the director and curator of the Wignall Museum. The Wignall Museum is a teaching museum and interdisciplinary art space that introduces Chaffey College students, faculty, staff, and community members to innovative contemporary art objects and ideas. By fostering critical thinking, visual literacy, discourse, and empathy, the museum seeks to enhance the intellectual and cultural life of our community. We want to take a moment to recognize that we are situated on the Rancho Cucamonga campus of Chaffey College, which resides on the traditional and unceded lands of the Tongva people. We offer our recognition and respect to the elders, both past, present, and future.
Hello, my name is Roman Stollenwerk. I'm assistant curator at the Wignall Museum. Please visit us at www.chaffey.edu/Wignall to access our full schedule of programs and available recordings. When possible, recordings remain available on our website. Announcements post to our email subscribers and social media when new videos are available. All recordings on our site include captions and audio descriptions as options. You can follow us on social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Wignall Museum. Visit our website About Us page if you'd like to sign up to receive email announcements. And we also ask that you complete a brief survey after the session at www.tinyurl.com/Wignall Spring 21 Visitor Survey. Thank you.
And hello, everyone. My name is Andy Hadel. I am the preparator at the museum. In a moment, Jaime Muñoz will present his work. Any time remaining after the presentation will be available for Q&A.
Thanks, Roman and Andy. So today I have the pleasure to introduce our guest artist, Jaime Muñoz. Jaime Muñoz was born in Los Angeles and received a BA in Fine Arts at UCLA in 2016. The visual language of his work is focused on aspects of identity, the commodification of labor, religion, and the critique of Latin American colonialism and modernism. He is inspired by concepts of blood memory, the relationship that ancestral ties have to the present day experience. He is also inspired by the concept of toyoteria, which is the working class shared experience through economic necessity around the R-Series Toyota mini work trucks. A driving force in his technique is inspired by decorative aspects of common everyday life and ordinary objects found in his community. Muñoz currently lives and works in Pomona, California. Jaime is also a graduate of Chaffey College, so we're delighted to have him with us today. Please join me in giving Jaime a warm virtual welcome. Thanks, Jaime.
Thank you for having me. It feels really good to circle back where I started in my art career. I appreciate the invite and look forward to sharing what I've been working on since then. Starting off with this piece right here. This was a work that I made in 2019. And I'm starting off with this work because it's a work that kind of started this new body of work that I'm currently working on, where I was where I'm focusing on one aspect of my interests in my art. And this one in particular is basically looking at religiosity from the colonial period and really examining aspects of my identity, looking at the contradiction that exists in that history and in myself. But before I go there, I just want to talk about my background first, because my background in art, because all of that is very informative of how I construct my compositions and my concepts and the meaning in my work. So I'm not sure if you guys know, but my background originally was in commercial art. The majority of my time spent at Chaffey, I was in the graphic design program. And during my time studying that, like, I've always been fascinated about, how can I say it, like the like kind of like aggressive advertising, where you're seeing artists commissioned to push an idea or a belief to sell something. And I feel like when you look at that contemporary times, it's easy to identify, because when you look at like hypercapitalism, it's all around us. But it's also interesting to see where that existed in the arts, like before the modernity. Like when you look at, like specifically what I look at, what I've been looking at recently, in the like Latin American colonial art, like I see it in the same vein, like commissioned artists to kind of push an idea or a belief on an agenda. So with this work, I was starting off with the image of La Virgen de Guadalupe, which is, you know, her image exists in popular culture, you know, that's beyond just the confines of the church, you know. And I've always felt like that was kind of like radical, how like her image was designed to depending on your sources, either educate or colonize a native people, you know. But then at the same time, like once it enters in the sphere of popular culture, like the people kind of can navigate and dictate how they relate to that. And that's how I relate with all the religious iconography that I grew up with. And like the tension that I felt later on, understanding like the history of colonization and like spirituality and capitalism, and then the modernist period, and just really exploring a lot of different avenues from that. So in this work, like I mentioned, the bottom half is La Virgen de Guadalupe, who was really modeled after the Mexica earth goddess Tonantzin, or Coatlicue, who is the earth goddess. And, you know, so there's a lot of stylistic elements to her image that make her appealing to the native people. Like, for instance, she's brown. There's images on her garment that are seen on other Mexica goddesses, like Xochipilli, like the god of art, and I think dance. You would know, Machado, Xochipilli. I'm glad you're here, because you're like the master of all of this. But some of the flowers found on that goddess's relics are seen here on her garment. So I wanted to create a composition that spoke to that history, because, like, you know, like growing up, first generation Chicano, like you're surrounded by this iconography, and I just felt like there's also, like, looking at like the history of like the like colonial, like Latin American colonial painting. I just felt like there's like a lot of room there to try to recontextualize those narratives and create new iconography, so that people can have an entry point into learning their history. And that's kind of my intention with like this recent body of work. But it all started with this painting. And so, like, previously, I feel like my interests in each painting were kind of all over the place. Like there's a chronology, like there's like the colonial period, and there's things that I look at that. But then like I'm also like looking at like the modernist period, and like looking at the commodification of labor, and just kind of the outcome of like the colonial period, like looking at how in our country we saw a lot of that as progress, but from my experience, working class doesn't really feel like progress, you know. So that's like another aspect that I was exploring in other work, that was all mixed up. So my intention was to kind of just hone in on like one like topic. So right now it's like this like religious colonial like concept. This was like the next piece that I made that's part of this series. And this one's titled 529 Years, basically the amount of years since 1492, which looking at the history, I know my focus is Latin America, and I know like the dates for that is a little later, like 1500s, but I'm still using 1492 as like an index for like just colonization of the Americas in general. Because I didn't want to make it too confusing, you know. So again, like going back to my interest in commercial art, like I gravitate towards iconography that exists in popular culture, and also in particular for these two, this is a diptych, and like the image you see in the back, that's actually what was produced by like a printing company, like in the from like who that existed from like the 1800s all the way to like early 20th century, and I'm trying to remember their name. I wrote it down in here somewhere, but it's like Eve's something and company, and it's like a print that they made. So I was really interested that image that is so commonly known was produced by this commercial printing company. And then in the center is the story of Popo and Itza, who the work was also created by this artist, Jesus Huelguera, who was also a commercial artist. And I just felt like, another thing, like both of the works were kind of made in the same period. So I just thought it was interesting how like both of these images, like juxtaposing them together, has like a lot of charged meaning. So with the narrative of Popo and Itza, there's an aspect of the narrative where Popo is like cursing the heavens. So I kind of see that as like a moment of reflection on the colonial history, and using that as like the foreground in this work, and kind of like navigating that convo with the crosshairs. And so in the image, he's pointing his arrow to the sky. That's the narrative that I was talking about of cursing the heavens. And well, let me just go back and talk. Just if you guys are not familiar with the story of Popo and Itza, it's basically like another version of Romeo and Juliet, where Popo, who was like a Mexica warrior, was in love with Itza, but didn't have the approval of her father, and was sent off to war in hopes that he would die there, you know. And her father told her that he died in battle, and she died of sadness. And then when he returned, that's when he was like scorning the heavens, and that's like the climax of this narrative. And it's just interesting because this artist that I mentioned, Jesus Huelguera, he's kind of documented different aspects of that narrative, and to me, I just found this part kind of like the climax of that narrative. And I just thought it was interesting to kind of juxtapose them together and like recontextualize again like this religious iconography and say a little more. And one last thing, there's two mountains and there's two volcanoes in Mexico City that are supposed to represent them as well. Like there's a dormant volcano that's supposed to represent Itza, and the active volcano is supposed to represent Popo. Yeah. And I'm also starting to do something a little different in this work too. Like going back to my interest in commercial art, I was always really inspired by like artists like man, I'm forgetting his name. But he did a lot of like psychedelic poster art, and like used a lot of like opposite colors to create like kind of like this like optical tension. And I thought that was like interesting, like in I always felt that was interesting for him to do that, because he was kind of like breaking the rules that they teach you in like graphic design. Like you want to use colors that are pleasing to the eye. You don't want to you want to use fonts that are legible. Like he was doing like the complete opposite of all of that. And something about how like the colors create like this visual tension when you look at it. I was very interested in, because I know in religious art, whenever there's like a visceral experience, like that's supposed to be like you're feeling like the grace of God, kind of like with stained glass windows when you go into a cathedral. I learned this in your class, Machado. When you go into a cathedral and you see the light shining through the stained glass, you're supposed to feel like the visceral presence of God. And my intention in these works is to also try to create a visceral experience, but kind of like a decolonial, like recontextualization of like this history, and just trying to yeah, basically do the same thing, but from like a decolonial gaze, um, his name is, damn, hold on. Oh yeah, Victor Moscoso. Yeah, I just forgot his name right now. I think it's just because I'm nervous, but that's the artist that really influenced me. And then this was like the next work that I did, where I'm basically doing the same thing, like finding two charged images, where there's like two narratives that are like close enough where I can juxtapose them together, where you can like create like a narrative. So again, here, like Michelangelo Pieta, another commercial artist, commissioned to do this work. And then another moment in the narrative of Popo and Itza from the artist Jesus Huelguera. And I just thought it was interesting how like the images are like emulating each other. And I felt like Jesus was like doing kind of like what I was trying to do, like kind of hijack the imagery, like the religious imagery, but placing like the brown body. So like that was kind of like my intention here too, to like juxtapose these together, and also try to create like this visceral experience again with like the focal points of the paintings. And I feel like this one was like the most successful one. Like if you had a chance to see it in person, if you look at it from a certain angle, it really does like an optical thing, the title of this work is Tension. And again, I chose to use that title because like visually I'm juxtaposing two images that to me create a tension, but then like also visually there's like a tension too, like when our eyes are seeing something that is challenging in terms of information, where that would create like an optical effect. It's because it's creating like a physical tension in your retina that's allowing you to experience like this like psychedelic experience, And so that was like another reason why I decided to title it Tension. And then these were, I actually made these like in the middle, but I figured I would just kind of go with like I made them at the same time, but the chronology seems better the way that I'm presenting it now. So this one's titled Shipping Container Apparition #1. And again, I'm trying to like just continue with like the that's the same narrative, and like in it, it's like a shipping container. To me, like represents kind of like this idea of capitalism, commodification, but then also like when you look at the history of like capitalism, it's alongside like the history of like religion, So I always felt that it's interesting, like those two histories being juxtaposed together, like you know, and trying to create a composition that's kind of like saying something around there. I titled it Shipping Container Apparition because the focal point in these are a lot more abstract. And that's another thing that I'm interested in, like the history of like apparitions and how you know, if you guys don't know what that is, it's basically when like it's basically when God or like some type of religious figure appears in like an inanimate object or something, and then they say like, oh, like this is like an act of God, like this is the presence of God, you know. And so I wanted to like incorporate that into this work, which I'm not sure if you can tell immediately that this is like the Christ, but I kind of wanted it to be like not so obvious and like force the viewer to spend time with the work to make that connection. And basically this was like another work that I made that was part of these two works. But both of these are going to be part of a group show in Germany for a gallery a weekend. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that art fair, but so I made them at the same time. So the compositions are like similar, but these two are not diptychs. They're not meant to. They're not seen as one. They're separate works. And basically, it's the same concept with this one. And also, I feel like an aspect that inspired these two works was, you know, my experience growing up in Fontana, because that was like a period in my life where like my mom was really like religious, but then also I was around a lot of like shipping containers and trucks, because like Fontana is kind of like a shipping port, you know. So I just felt like these two paintings are kind of like indexical of like that period in my life where it was like both of those worlds like coming together and kind of influencing me in this way. And that's pretty much it. That's all of the recent work that I've been working on right now.
Thanks, Jaime. Can you tell us what the media is that you're working on in these paintings?
All of the paintings are on wood panel, and they also have texture paste, glitter, and paper.
And then is it oil, acrylic?
Acrylic,
aerosol?
acrylic. Yes.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much for sharing about your recent work. I'd love to open it up to questions of our guests.
Yeah, I would just comment on a few things. I mean, I just, of course, really enjoyed seeing your development over the last decade or so. Always a big fan of your work. You know, having you and both your brothers in my classes.
Yeah.
Able to go to pre-Columbian exhibitions with all three of you is just a wonderful thing. You see one of your brothers' works on the wall right behind my head, actually.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So you've become, in addition to the visual arts that you create, you become a historian, a cultural storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very important for the intersection of everything going on in the Empire, your background, and everything that you've learned over the last decade. So it's really beautiful to see all that come together in your work. And as Rebecca said, coming back to Chaffee to speak, and as you did 3 years ago, you did an exhibition for my nonprofit, the arts area in Ontario. You know, in the midst of you're preparing for exhibitions on both coasts and internationally, and you still took the time to put an exhibition on back here in the Inland Empire, because that you're looking, like you say, you're indexing your understanding of your pre-Columbian, your colonial, your modern history, but also your physical history, your connections to the Inland Empire, now overlapping with all of these art centers as they're more commonly identified, but recognizing the amount of creativity that we have here locally too. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you for everything, and I always enjoy seeing your new work.
Oh, thank you, John. Oh, I see a question here from Edith.
Yes.
I just want to say hi, Edith. It's been a long time since I worked with her. I remember I worked with her in the Wignall, but she was asking me if she's reading the painting through an environmental lens too. And I'm happy she's saying that, because that's something that I think about when when you look at the history of colonization, and then leading up to like the modernist period, like all of those capitalist modes of progress that we've seen for so long as progress is like kind of catching up to us now, whether it being like humanitarian issues or environmental, and so that is definitely something that I think about too. And I didn't mention this, but with the last two paintings, the shipping container apparitions, another thing that I liked about abstracting the image of Christ was also they looked like maps. So so thinking of the map, I'm also kind of thinking of the globe, and I do think of like environmental issues too, alongside with like the humanitarian issues that modernism has like brought us to. It's just interesting, like people have been disposable. That the commodification of human labor is apparent, but like we only have like one Earth, and like that isn't disposable. Like we fucked that one up once, and it's fucked. And that's where I feel we're at right now, like in terms of climate. Like it's like it's all like catching up to us. I don't know if that makes sense, but anyway, I just wanted to kind of comment on Edith's observation.
Yeah, thanks,
Oh,
Jaime.
another person said, what made you switch from graphic design, commercial art to fine art? Oh, honestly, it was Mitchell Syrop. Yeah, because he was my graphic design teacher, and all the way up to the end of my time at Chafee, like I was like ready to transfer to a university, or the university, to finish my degree in commercial art. But then I did the student invitational, and he was like, "Hey, I think you should reconsider and apply for fine art." But I was always really hesitant, because coming from my background, working class, like it's a big decision to choose to do fine art when you're thinking of like your livelihood. It's a big gamble. So the closest thing that I felt I was able to pursue that would gain me economic stability was commercial art. I felt like, oh, like that seems more practical. But Mitchell convinced me like to at least try to apply to at least one school for fine art, and he convinced me to apply to UCLA, and that was the only school I applied to. And I was like, well, if I get into there, then I'll do it. If I don't, then I'll just continue in the path that I was on. But it was a spontaneous decision.
I was thinking maybe I could bounce off that topic that you're just running with right now with another question, if you're all right with it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So, as a former Chafee student, a product of community college, if you will, do you have any advice for young artists, or any of our,
Okay.
graduates or creative minds?
Okay.
Future?
Yeah. I think that's a very important question to raise for other creative people. I have two younger brothers who are also like interested in the creative world, and like I always tell them, like just like really be true and honest to yourself in where your identity is at. Like if you feel like how can I say it? Whatever you feel is going to bring you satisfaction in life, like naturally, without any expectation, you know. And I do understand, once you commodify that joy, it changes your relationship to it. But I feel like that gives you like a head start into success, because like you're not really forcing yourself to like be somewhere where you don't belong, you know. And like that's kind of like the advice that I give my brothers, you know, like whatever you decide to do, whatever path you choose to be on, like it's gonna require a lot of discipline, you know, because like talent doesn't take you all the way, you know. Like we live in a system, and there's a way things go, and not everyone gets the same opportunities. Like sometimes it just matters where you're at, you know, where you get an opportunity, you know. And yeah, just talent doesn't take you all the way. It requires a lot of discipline and hard work. But if you're not willing to stick around during that period of sacrifice, then find find the thing that you're able to I guess be more comfortable making sacrifices for, I guess. You know what I mean? And yeah, I mean that's what I would say. Yeah.
We're probably all tired of talking about the pandemic, but
Uh-huh.
I really do think it's interesting. You know, we've talked to so many artists, and for some folks, it's literally like completely changed their practice. And for other people, it's just maybe given more studio time, or you know, it hasn't become a focal point or even a sort of underlying
Yeah.
subtext. So I'm curious to know how the last year plus has affected or not affected your practice.
It hasn't really affected it. Like I've already kind of lived a lifestyle in solitude, working in the studio. But it definitely has impacted how I relate to the world in terms of like death. You know, like I have been thinking of like death a lot more, and maybe that's the reason why I've been focusing on like this like decolonial, like spiritual, like vein in my work. I don't know, but I have been thinking about that a lot. And like there was a period during the pandemic where I got really sick, where I thought I had a COVID, but it wasn't, you know. But that was kind of like a reality check, where it was like, oh man, like this is scary, you know, because I was experiencing the symptoms of it, you know, and I really felt like I had it, but it wasn't that. So yeah, just in the sense of thinking of like just death, you know. Yeah.
I think it's on everybody's brains quite a
Yeah.
bit more, right, than
Yeah.
the past. But I wanted to ask about your inspiration that you derive from Toyoteria. Am I saying
Oh,
it?
okay. Yeah.
And I'm curious to know, I know
Hmm.
we may not see it in your current body of work, but I'm
Right.
curious how it translates into your practice.
Uh-huh. So it's a Toyoteria, you know. So like going back to my background, like working class, you know. Um like I grew up around working trucks, you know. And like my mind shifted there when I did this video piece in UCLA, where I was juxtaposing the image of a horse and a pickup truck like running in like a landscape. And at the time, that work was more intuitive, you know, like it just made sense somehow. And then after I made it, that's where like the meaning kind of started like developing. And like a big inspiration in where that conversation went was a conversation I had with my grandfather, where he was talking to me about his experience with modernism catching up to his pueblo, where he's from in Jalisco, Mexico, and seeing the transition of when people stopped using the horse and started using machinery a lot more, you know. And so the conversation was around the technology of it, you know, but then also seeing human labor as a form of technology that's been commodified, you know? And when you look at like that early modernist period, like there's like that's like the early history of like civil rights period or working class history, you know? Where you know, it's like a history of the mechanization of labor, you know, where like whatever human that exists in a human being is like taken out to standardize the production, you know? And like that history always resonated with me because like you feel that, you know, like when you work, like I used to work in construction and warehouses, and when you have certain jobs that are like that, where you just feel like there's like no acknowledgement of like your human being, and the only thing valuable is like the labor you produce, like it impacts you, you know, like you feel like a machine, you know? So I always felt like using like that pickup as like an index for that was like interesting, because like it's to me, I see it as like a portrait, especially when like you're driving behind one of those pickup trucks, like they're um fully decorated with little stickers and things on the back, and like it's just like a window of like the identity of the person driving it, but then also like the work truck itself serves like as like an aspect of that identity, a window, you know? So so like my intention was to like use that as like an index for like my critique of like modernism and exploring conversations around the commodification of labor, and like just kind of building that conversation with the pickup truck. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
It's obvious that you put a lot of time and thought into the compositions that you're painting.
Yeah.
And I noticed with at least the ones that you've shown and some of the ones I've seen on your website, your paintings, that is, that there's either kind of a cap, sometimes something that's on the bottom that's, or even around the edges where there's a lot of patterning, repetitive kind of colors and icons and stuff like that. I was wondering if you have anything to say about that aspect of your
yeah, definitely. So again, going back to commercial art, and there's a gray line here too, because like depending on like what zone you're looking at, like I'm really interested in decorative art that exists in like textiles or architecture. And oftentimes when you think of decorative art, it doesn't serve a function really. But when you look at the decorative art in textiles that exists in Peru, for example, like that's a coded system of meaning, you know? So it's not only purely decorative. And even in some of the geometric patterning that I use in my paintings, sometimes that's not all purely decorative either. Like I know, for example, in Mesoamerican architecture, like you'll see like geometric patterning, and like there's one that looks like a G, and like I learned that in some street gangs, like they've adopted that pattern that's supposed to symbolize like a rank in like a gang. So like things like that I'm like very fascinated about, like because there's an existing conversation of decorative art, but I don't feel like there's a balance of conversation of like that it's not purely just decorative, you know, like sometimes it's serving some type of function. In my work, it is just decorative. Like I'm not really referencing that history or trying to go there. I'm just really inspired by the beauty of it, and using it as like a decorative element to frame the work. But I am interested in those conversations, but they're not like central points of like my themes or anything like that. Yeah.
can I ask you a question about
Yeah.
your color palette for this series in
Uh-huh.
particular? I mean, it's very, so you mentioned talking about the way that, the kind of the tension between the contrasting colors, but
Yeah.
specifically very red.
Yeah.
Is there, has that long been a particular color palette that you're interested in, or in this series, are you particularly kind of focusing in on, it's a very, it's a blood-like, it's a very specific kind of color
Yeah.
palette. So I was just curious how you kind of choose your palette and stuff like that.
For sure. So, like I'm really into like working with like a monochromatic like aesthetic or color scheme, and so like for each individual work that I work on, like that's something that I think about. But recently, I've been thinking about like the aesthetic of an entire body of work. And so, for example, my recent solo show at the Pit, like after I looked at the whole body of work, it didn't really seem so monochromatic anymore. Cause like one painting would be blue, one painting would be red, one painting would be so so also too, I felt like it would be interesting to like go off of that based on the theme that I'm focusing on. So that first painting that I showed you guys, Madre, kind of like dictated what color I was going to continue with. Since like that was like the focal point of the series, I was like, okay, that was the focal point of this series. So I'm going to continue with red. And then maybe later when I catch up, when I continue in the chronology of my interest, when I go reach up to like the modernist period and looking at labor and all of that, like that'll be a different color, And so that's kind of like the way I'm designing it in my mind. But other things that have inspired me around that, definitely like the silk screening posters from Victor Moscoso. A lot of them were like monochromatic in that way, but also do you know these San Marcos blankets? They're like Mexican blankets of like a line of like animals or like plants, and like usually they're like it's like all one color. I don't know if you've known or seen those, but like that's like that has inspired me too, like just aesthetic, like what that looks like. I've always been kind of drawn to that, yeah.
Jaime, you mentioned a few artists who inspire you. I'm curious if you could tell us who else you're interested in today, and maybe some artists you'd like to amplify.
Yeah, contemporary artists that really inspire me today. Definitely Rafa Esparza, who's a performance artist. He's been a big inspiration in terms of the like similar themes that he's exploring. Technically, another artist that is a big inspiration is Mario Ayala, who is an airbrush. He also works with the airbrush, but he's like a master airbrush painter. And I also work with airbrush. He's a big inspiration. Who else? I mentioned Victor Moscoso. I've also been really inspired by this Japanese commercial artist. His name is Tadanori Yoko. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. He's been a big inspiration too. And then again, like just like looking at a lot of Latin American colonial art, like that's inspiring too. Yeah.
So Neil asks, how is your art received in Latin America and Europe?
Well, I recently so that work 529 years, the image of Christ with the thorns and Poponitsa, that was shown in Madrid in Spain. And I'm not sure what the like critical discourse of that work was, because I wasn't there, but I know it was received well. But I'm curious to know like what critics or like people who contribute to the canon of art would say, specifically since I'm specifically speaking of a history in those zones, you know. But I'm not sure how it's received. I haven't read anything or heard of any response on any of my work from out there. I'm just barely starting to show internationally, so maybe next year I'll have a better idea of how people are receiving my work out there. Yeah.
I have a question that kind of bounces off one of Rebecca's earlier questions, and it's aside from artists that you enjoy and you look at, is there any media that you're consuming right now that you could kind of like be like, this is really kind of moving my art forward? Is it just television, books, any of that kind of stuff?
It's hard to say because I have a tendency to jump around a lot of books, you know. Two of them, I'll say two. One of them is a catalog from LACMA, and it was an exhibition that they had on Mesoamerican art in the 70s. And it's a really nice catalog that has really like beautiful images and really like thorough explanations of each image, of well, not the images, of the artifacts, you know. That's one that I've continuously been sourcing. And then also to another catalog, also from LACMA. It was the Painted in Mexico exhibit. It was a show on Latin American colonial art. So those two books have been kind of like on my workbench, and I've been kind of looking at that a lot. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Jaime. I know we're nearing the end of our time together, so I really want to thank you for your generosity. We're grateful to have you back at Chafee and spend some time with you.
Yeah.
I want to also thank everyone who attended today and carved out a little space in their calendar to hang out with us. We appreciate you. And Roman will put in the chat a link to a very short survey. We'd appreciate 2 minutes of your time. If you wouldn't mind completing that, we'd greatly appreciate it. But huge thanks to you all, particularly you, Jaime. Wonderful to see you.
Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, we can't wait to see what comes next. So thanks again. And everyone, please take good care.
All right. Likewise.
See you.